A change in the 2020 presidential race among the Democrats.
So the CNN poll is the first since last week's debates, and it shows some big gains for, look at this, Senators Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren. But at the same time, there's frontrunner Joe Biden. He actually saw his support drop in a pretty big way. So Brandy's here. The polling also not so good for our state governor, Jay Inslee.
Yeah, there had been a hope that for people who didn't know him, and his name recognition wasn't good, and even his campaign acknowledged that. And we had sent people out to the streets to talk to voters in swing states. Not one person who he showed his picture to knew who he was.
That wasn't a good sign.
It's not a good sign, but you know, the campaign always knew that. But their hope had been, look, once he gets on the debate stage and Americans get to see him in that spotlight, his name recognition will increase and thus his polling will increase. But that's not what the governor's campaign saw. In fact, he went from polling at 1% in the month before the debate to an asterisk next to his name, which suggests that the support is at zero or near zero. And at the same time, as Liz had said, we have other candidates who saw major gains after the debates. Let's just take a look at those quick, and then we'll get into sort of the specifics behind Inslee's polling results. So Senators Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren saw huge increases after the debates. And when you look at those numbers at this graphic, so for Kamala Harris, she went from 8% to 17%. Elizabeth Warren, 7% to 15%. Joe Biden is interesting because although he is still leading the pack, and the question here was, it was posed to Democratic voters and Democratic-leaning independent voters. The question was, who do you support for the nomination? Joe Biden went from 32% support in May to 22% support as part of that. So his support dropped significantly. Back to Governor Inslee on this. So I had asked him the morning after the debate, he came on our show to talk about his performance. And I had asked him at the time, look, if your polling numbers don't go up significantly, do you have to reconsider maybe your future in this race? Listen. If you guys aren't seeing the polls go up or the number of donors go up to maybe where they need to be in regards to the fall debates, when do you make a decision about whether you're going to stay in this race? Because your campaign told me just last week you haven't ruled out seeking a third term as governor. So at what point do you have to decide whether this candidacy is viable?
Well, we think it is viable because this message, two reasons. One, this message is so resonant. Climate change is the number one priority for Democrats. In fact, a poll came out this morning in that regard. Mm-hmm. And number two, we have a story that is much bigger than me, and that's the story of a state that has embraced these values that have led it to be so successful economically. Those two things are unassailable.
But look, long story short, these aren't the poll results that the Inslee campaign wants. I will give you one caveat, and you can read the full poll and how they figured everything out on our website, q30fox.com. The one thing I'll say is before June, the way that they were polling is that they were polling just any possible Democratic voter or Democratic-leaning independent. But with this latest round after the debate, they actually polled only registered voters, so it definitely changes the pool of people they're asking this question to. So that could attribute to him going from 1% to just having an asterisk by his name as well.
He has some big decisions to make and not a lot of time to make them in terms of his gig that he's going to be going after, right?
Right, and you know, we try to get a date out of him, like when do you have to decide by? Because the governor will not rule out running for a third term as governor. But if you're going to do that, you know, that election is also in 2020, and you're going to have to make a decision soon about whether you want to start campaigning for that or continue to campaign for president. What I will say about that is Inslee's already qualified for the July debate in Detroit. He's not going to drop out before then. However, if he fails to qualify for the September and October debates, which have an increased threshold where you need to get 130,000 unique donors or 2% in the pollings, if he doesn't qualify for that, that might be a point in time when he says, okay, I'm going to switch gears here.
So I was also curious, we talked about this a little bit earlier. I mean, I'm interested in knowing what made people change their minds. I mean, if Joe Biden's going down in the polls,
Sure.
Why did people not pick him and say picked Kamala Harris? I mean, did we get any other takeaways like that from a poll like this?
Yeah, there's a lot of, it's actually a pretty complex poll, and I always encourage people to go read it, and we have the whole thing on our website. There were a couple different things that they asked voters, not only who would you support for the nomination, but who do you think would best handle an issue like health care? Who do you think would best handle an issue like race relations, which Joe Biden didn't perform well on the debate? There was also a simple question about who did perform the best on the debate. One quick thing, I literally pulled this for you, Liz, on all these debate papers here. this one I thought was fascinating. The question was, who do you think would best handle the issue of the climate crisis?
Yeah.
So you'd think, well, if they know who he is, they'd probably say Jay Inslee. Only 6%. Only 6% thought that Jay Inslee would be the best candidate to handle the climate
Well,
crisis.
I mean, he only had 5 minutes of airtime,
Yeah,
right?
another thing,
And
he
he
only
wasn't
had
able
5.
to really hit that point as strongly as he wanted.
Yeah, you got one question on the climate crisis, 5 minutes of airtime. So to suggest that that's going to get him all this new name recognition, what that number indicates to me is people just still don't know who he is.
Also
if they
make a
did
bigger
know,
splash next
right,
debate.
if they did know who he was, clearly that's probably the person that many of them would say, well, yeah, he's been dealing with the climate crisis, you know, his whole career as a politician. So I just thought that was an interesting stat for you there.
Interesting, yeah.
All right, Brandy, thanks. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you.
Let's check in with Tim Joyce right now.
Yeah, happy birthday as well, Brandy.